Welcome back, everyone. Tonight's story starts with a woman who had spent 3 years making herself forgettable. Quiet work, quiet rooms, quiet hands that translated other people's words without ever speaking her own. She was good at it, invisible even. The kind of invisible that takes real effort to maintain. The territory she was entering didn't welcome strangers. Iron Hollow had been closed to outside translators for 6 years, since the last Alpha King had sealed his borders and stopped answering council correspondence altogether. No one came in, no one was invited. And Draven Ashford had spent those 6 years building walls that had nothing to do with stone. He'd lost his mate. He'd named the grief and buried it and moved on. Or so he told anyone who asked, which was no one, because no one asked twice. He was the kind of man who made questions feel unnecessary. Then the council sent her, Mara Voss. Quiet hands, sharp eyes, a leather satchel full of dictionaries she'd annotated in 3 languages. She came to translate a manuscript that was 7 centuries old and allegedly contained pack law provisions no living wolf remembered. She had no idea she was already written into it. Let's begin. The gate to Iron Hollow opened on a Tuesday in late autumn, and Mara Voss walked through it the way she walked into most rooms. Head down, satchel over one shoulder, cataloging details the way some people breathe. Stone on the left, older than the stone on the right, torches in iron brackets, the kind that had been replaced so many times the brackets had worn smooth. A courtyard that smelled of cold and peat, and something older underneath both. She had been hired by the territorial council to translate a manuscript. That was the whole of it. 3 weeks, possibly 4, a stipend she'd already spent in her head on rent and reference texts, and then she'd go back to the city and her quiet apartment and her annotated dictionaries, and no one would remember she'd been here at all. That was the plan. She made it approximately 12 feet into the courtyard before the first wolf stopped moving. He was carrying a crate of something heavy, and he set it down without looking at it, which was the kind of thing that happened when the body acted before the mind caught up. Mara noticed him stop. She noticed the one behind him stop too, and then the one near the far wall, and the woman crossing from the eastern corridor, and the 2 men talking near the well, who simply ceased talking and turned toward her with expressions she couldn't immediately classify. Not threat, not exactly. Something else. One of them, the man with the crate, lowered his head. Not a bow exactly, more like a weight pulling him down, slow and involuntary, the way a branch bends under snow. The woman near the corridor did the same. And then the ones at the well, and the figure in the doorway she hadn't noticed until he moved, and within 30 seconds of Mara Voss walking through the gate of Iron Hollow, every wolf in the courtyard had gone still and quiet and was looking at the ground. Mara stood in the center of it and felt the particular discomfort of someone who has spent 3 years perfecting invisibility and has just become, without warning, extremely visible. She counted the wolves. 14. She counted the torches. 6. She counted her own heartbeats because that was what she did when she didn't know what else to do, and she got to 11 before a voice came from the covered walkway to her left. "You're the translator." It wasn't a question. The voice was low and flat and landed with the particular weight of someone who had stopped softening things a long time ago. She turned. He was standing in the shadow of the walkway, which seemed deliberate. Broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from actual use rather than performance. Dark hair, gray eyes that were doing something careful and contained that she couldn't read yet. He was looking at her the way you look at something you weren't expecting and aren't sure what to do with. "Mara Voss," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment that was too long and too short at the same time. Then he looked at his courtyard full of wolves with their heads bowed, and something moved across his face. Something controlled and quick. like a shutter closing. "Cass," he said, without raising his voice. A young woman appeared from somewhere behind him, maybe 19, with the particular calm of someone who had learned early that panic was a waste of energy. "My lord." "Show her to the scriptorium." He didn't look at Mara again. "The manuscript is on the center table. Don't touch the binding." He walked back into the shadow of the walkway and was gone. Mara looked at Cass. Cass looked at Mara with an expression that was carefully neutral and slightly fascinated. "This way," Cass said. Mara followed her, and as she walked, the wolves in the courtyard slowly, one by one, lifted their heads. She filed it away without knowing why. The scriptorium was on the second floor of the east wing, a long room with high windows and a fireplace that was doing its best against the cold and not quite winning. The manuscript was on the center table as promised, 7 centuries old, bound in something dark and cracked, pages that had been handled by so many hands they'd gone soft at the edges. Mara set down her satchel, pulled on her work gloves, and opened to the first page. The language was old Pack dialect, the kind that had been formal even when it was living, full of compound constructions and ceremonial weight. She could read it. That was why they'd sent her specifically. She was one of 4 people in the territory who could read it, and the other 3 were dead or retired. She began. The first 3 days passed the way work days pass when the work is absorbing, in long stretches of concentration broken by meals she barely tasted and sleep she fell into fully dressed. Cass brought food at regular intervals and sometimes sat in the corner with her own work, which Mara appreciated. The silence between them was the comfortable kind. On the 4th day, he came to the scriptorium. She heard him before she saw him. The particular weight of his footstep on old stone, unhurried and even, the kind of walk that didn't need to announce itself because it already owned the floor. She didn't look up from the manuscript. He stopped on the other side of the table. "Progress?" he said. "The first 40 pages are largely administrative," she said, still reading. "Territorial boundaries, succession provisions, council jurisdiction, standard for the period." She turned a page carefully. "The next section is more interesting." "Interesting how?" She looked up then. He was watching her with those gray eyes that had gone very still, and she had the brief, strange sensation of being read rather than looked at. "There are provisions here that haven't been cited in living pack law," she said. "Bond law, specifically. Conditions under which a bond can be dissolved. Conditions under which a bond must be named." She held his gaze. "I wasn't aware the old law distinguished between the two." Something shifted in his expression. "Not much, just a fraction." "Keep translating," he said. He left the way he'd arrived. She listened to his footsteps until they faded, then looked back at the manuscript and spent the next hour reading a passage she had already read twice because she kept losing her place. She filed it away, went back to work. On the 6th day, she heard footsteps stop outside the scriptorium door at midnight. She was still at the table. She often worked late. The quiet suited her, and she heard them clearly. Steady even, and then not. Stopped, right outside the door. She looked up at the door and waited. The footsteps didn't continue. The door didn't open. After a long moment, they retreated. Back down the corridor, unhurried, even, as if the stopping had been accidental and the retreating was simply the logical next step. Mara sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. On the 8th day, she found the passage. It was buried in the middle of the manuscript, in a section she'd initially catalogued as ceremonial law, the kind of formal language that surrounded naming rituals and bond declarations. She'd been translating steadily, and then she stopped. She read it again. She read it a 3rd time. The old dialect was precise about this, which was the thing about old pack law. It left very little room for ambiguity when it chose to be specific. The passage described a particular type of bond, not the standard fated bond, which the manuscript had already addressed in Section 3. This was something rarer, something the text called a resonance bond, a bond that formed not at first sight, but at first arrival, when one mate entered the other's territory, when the gate opened. The pack would know first, the text said. The pack always knew first. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she looked at the courtyard through the window. Empty now, frost on the stone, 2 torches burning low. She thought about 14 wolves going still. She thought about footsteps that stopped outside a door and didn't knock. She thought about gray eyes doing something careful and contained. She picked up her pen and wrote, "Resonance bond, territorial activation, pack recognition precedes individual awareness." She underlined it twice. Then she went to find him. He was in the great hall, which was not great in any way that implied comfort. It was large and cold and built for function, with a long table and benches and a fire that had burned down to coals. He was sitting at the far end of the table with papers in front of him and a cup of something that had gone cold. And he looked up when she came in with the particular expression of someone who had been expecting this and had been hoping to be wrong. She set the translated passage on the table in front of him. She had written it out cleanly, the old dialect on the left, her translation on the right, precise and unambiguous. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. "You've read this," he said. "That's how reading works," she said. "Everyone reads before they finish." He looked up at her. Something in his face was very controlled and very tired. "Sit down," he said. She sat, not because he'd told her to, but because her legs had decided this was a reasonable moment to stop holding her up. He was quiet for a long time. The fire made small sounds. Outside, wind moved through the courtyard. "I knew," he said finally, "when the gate opened, before you crossed the courtyard." He said it the way he said everything, flat and final, no explanation offered, none needed. "I was at the window. I saw the gate open and I felt it and I thought—" He stopped, picked up the cup, set it down again. "I thought I was wrong." "Were you hoping you were wrong?" she said. He looked at her. "Yes." She held his gaze. "Why?" The silence stretched. He looked at the translated passage on the table between them, and she watched him decide something. "I had a mate," he said, 6 years ago. We named the bond. Formal ceremony, full council, the whole of it." He paused. "She left. 4 months later. Pack law allows it. A mate can dissolve a named bond if both parties agree." I agreed. He said it without inflection, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with grief. "I've been careful since then about naming things." Mara was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. A coal shifted and broke. "I'm not her," she said. "I know that. I mean—" She paused, choosing her words the way she chose words in translation, for precision. "I'm not going to leave because I'm afraid of the bond. I might leave because you make it impossible to stay, but the bond itself doesn't frighten me." She looked at him steadily. "What frightens me is that you'll spend the rest of whatever this is waiting for me to leave, and miss the part where I don't." He looked at her for a long time. The gray eyes had gone quieter than she'd seen them. "The manuscript," he said finally. "The provision. The resonance bond must be named within 30 days of territorial activation, or it begins to decay. Both parties." He said it carefully. "There are consequences for both parties." "I translated the passage," she said. "I'm aware." "Then you know we have 18 days," she said. "I've been counting." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Close enough. "There's a naming ceremony," he said. "It requires witnesses, council representatives. It's formal." I assumed. "It would be public. You would be affiliated. With the pack? With the territory?" He looked at her. "With me." "I understand what naming means," she said. "Do you want it?" he said. Not a demand, not a command. Flat and careful and genuinely asking, which was somehow the most disarming thing he'd done since she arrived. She looked at the passage on the table, at the old dialect on the left and her own words on the right, at the fire that had burned down to almost nothing. "Ask me again in the morning," she said. "When I've slept." He nodded. She stood. She walked to the door and then stopped because something occurred to her. "The footsteps," she said, "outside the scriptorium, the 6th night." He said nothing. "That was you," she said. A pause. "Yes." "Why didn't you knock?" The silence stretched long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I didn't know what I would say." She nodded once and walked out. In the morning, she told him yes. The council arrived 3 days later, which was faster than Mara had expected, and suggested someone had sent word before she'd given her answer, which she chose not to comment on. There were 4 of them, 2 territorial representatives and 2 from the Central Council. And they were the kind of careful, smooth-voiced people who made every statement sound like a reasonable question and every question sound like a trap. They convened in the council chamber on the ground floor, a room that smelled of old stone and old decisions, and Mara sat across the table from 4 people who were looking at her the way people look at an unexpected variable in an equation they thought they'd solved. "Miss Voss," the senior representative said. His name was Aldrich. He had the voice of someone who had spent decades being reasonable at people until they agreed with him. "You understand that a resonance bond is unusual, rare even. The council has a responsibility to verify the circumstances before any naming ceremony proceeds." "I translated the provision myself," Mara said. "I'm familiar with the circumstances." "Yes, but the translation—" He paused with the specific delicacy of someone choosing not to say what they actually mean. "The translation was performed by the individual who stands to benefit from a particular interpretation." Mara looked at him. "The old dialect uses the word solvere in the territorial activation clause. It means to release or to loose, as in the bond releases into the territory when the gate opens. Not to solve, not to create. It's a passive construction. The bond was already there. The gate opening simply activated it." She held his gaze. "I can provide the etymological references if that would help." Aldrich looked at Draven. Draven was sitting at the head of the table with his hands flat on the wood and an expression that said he was waiting for this to be over. "The Alpha King's previous bond," Aldrich began. "Is dissolved," Draven said, flat and final. "Legally and completely. The council certified it." "Yes, but given the circumstances of that dissolution, the council feels it's appropriate to—" "The translator stays," Draven said. The same tone, the same weight. Not louder, just more final, the kind of final that closes a door without slamming it. "The naming ceremony will proceed on Friday. The council is welcome to attend as witnesses, which is their function. If there are legal objections, they can be submitted in writing to the territorial advocate." He looked at Aldrich. "Is there anything else?" There was a pause. Aldrich looked at the other representatives. Something passed between them that was more political than verbal. "We'll need to review the full translation," Aldrich said. "Of course," Mara said. "I'll have the completed sections ready by Thursday." She said it pleasantly, which seemed to unsettle Aldrich more than if she'd said it sharply. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. The council left before dinner. In the corridor afterward, Draven fell into step beside her without comment, and they walked in silence for a moment that was easier than it should have been. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Which part?" "The etymology." "I've suspected it for some time," she said, "that councils respond better to precision than to argument. It's harder to dispute a passive construction than an opinion." He was quiet for a moment, then very quietly, almost to himself. She would have left the room. Mara glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead. He stopped, started again. She found the council difficult. She found the territory difficult. He paused. "Most things here difficult." "I find the fire in the scriptorium inadequate," Mara said. "The rest of it is fine." He looked at her then, and there it was. Not quite a smile, but the thing that lived in the neighborhood of one. The particular softening of a face that had been held tight for a long time. "I'll have someone look at the flue," he said. "I'd appreciate that," she said. They walked the rest of the corridor in silence, and it was the comfortable kind. Friday came with frost on the stone, which Mara had not planned for, and which meant her second-best boots were inadequate for the courtyard, which was where the ceremony was held. She stood in the cold and told herself the cold was fine, and her feet were fine, and everything was fine, and Cass appeared at her elbow with a pair of thick wool socks that were slightly too large and absolutely perfect, and Mara looked at her with an expression that was probably more grateful than the socks warranted. "He told me to bring them," Cass said. "He said you'd say your boots were adequate." "My boots are adequate," Mara said. "Your boots are decorative," Cass said, with the particular directness of someone who had decided they liked you. "Put the socks on." Mara put the socks on. The courtyard had filled while she wasn't looking. The whole pack, or close to it, wolves in human form standing in loose formation, the 4 council representatives at the far side with expressions carefully arranged into something between official and impressed, and Draven standing in the center of it all, with his hands at his sides and his face doing the controlled, careful thing it usually did, except that his eyes, when they found her across the courtyard, did something she hadn't seen them do before. They went warm. Just for a moment. Just a fraction. But she saw it. She walked across the frost-covered stone in her adequate boots and her slightly too large socks and stopped in front of him, and he looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. "You came," he said. "You asked," she said. He held out his hand. Open, palm up, the particular offering of someone who had decided to stop protecting themselves from the answer. She looked at it for a moment. The lines of it, the steadiness of it, the way it was just open and waiting without demand. She put her hand in his. The pack exhaled. Collectively, quietly, the particular exhale of something that had been held too long. Several wolves pressed fists to their chests. The council representatives wrote something down, which seemed like exactly the wrong response and also exactly the right one. Aldrich stepped forward with the formal language of the naming, old words, the same words that were in the manuscript, and Mara listened to them now not as a translator, but as something else, something that didn't have a clean word yet, and she thought, I know what these words mean. I know exactly what these words mean. Draven said his part. Flat and final, as always, but weighted differently. Weighted with intention rather than conclusion, which was a distinction she was only now learning to hear. She said hers. Clearly, without hesitation, the way she read difficult passages aloud to test their meaning. Aldrich said the final words. The pack responded with the old acknowledgement, a sound that was less a word and more a vibration, low and collective and ancient. Draven's hand tightened slightly around hers. That was all. They walked back across the courtyard together, and the wolves moved to let them through, and no one bowed this time. They just watched, with the particular expression of people who have been waiting for something to be resolved and are quietly relieved that it has been. Cass was waiting at the entrance to the east wing. She looked at their joined hands. She looked at Mara. She said, with complete composure, "Good." "Good?" Mara said. "That means she stays," Cass said, to no one in particular, and walked away. That evening, the fire in the scriptorium had been rebuilt properly. Someone had cleared the flue, and the wood was dry, and the room was actually warm for the first time since Mara had arrived. She was at the table with the last sections of the manuscript when Draven came in and sat down across from her without ceremony and poured himself tea from the pot Cass had left. They worked in silence for a while, or she worked, and he read through the translated section she'd completed, and the fire burned steadily. And outside, the frost was doing whatever frost does at night, and it was the particular quiet of a room that has stopped bracing. "Can I ask you something?" she said without looking up. "Yes." "When you said you knew when the gate opened?" She turned a page. "Before I crossed the courtyard, you said you were at the window." "Yes." "What were you doing before that? Before the gate opened?" A pause. "Reading correspondence?" "And when the gate opened?" "I stopped," he said. "Were you able to go back to it?" A longer pause. She looked up. He was looking at the translated passage in front of him, and his jaw was doing the tight thing, and his eyes had gone very quiet. "No," he said. She nodded and looked back at her work. "I counted 14 wolves in the courtyard," she said, "when I came through the gate. I count things when I'm nervous." "I know," he said. She looked up again. "How do you know that?" "Cass told me. She said you counted the torches in the east corridor on the second day, and the steps on the staircase." He looked at her. "She counts things too sometimes. She said it meant you were paying attention." Mara was quiet for a moment. "She's perceptive." "She has my sister's eyes," he said. "My sister was perceptive." He said it without elaboration, which meant the elaboration was available if she wanted it, and not required if she didn't. She wanted it, but not tonight. "The manuscript is almost finished," she said. "Another 2 days, maybe 3. "I know. After that, my contract with the council is technically complete." "I know," he said again. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the gray eyes that had been going quieter every day she'd been here, and something settled between them. Not a question and not an answer, just the particular stillness of two people who have stopped pretending they don't know what comes next. "The fire's better," she said. "I had the flue cleared." "I noticed." She looked back at the manuscript. "The scriptorium could use better candles, too. The ones you have are too soft. They gutter." "I'll have Cass find the other kind." "The tall ones, beeswax?" "Yes." She turned another page. He drank his tea. The fire burned steadily, and the frost stayed outside where it belonged, and the manuscript lay open between them with its 7 centuries of careful words, and Mara Voss, who had spent 3 years making herself forgettable, sat in a warm room in a closed territory and felt, for the first time in a long time, like someone who was exactly where she had been translated to be. She filed that away too. But this time, she knew why. And that's where we leave them. A king who spent 6 years afraid to name anything, and a woman who translated the exact law that named her. I have to know, what did you think of Mara? Because she walked into a room full of wolves, found the passage that described her own fate, and then went to find him herself. No waiting, no panicking, just went and found him. Drop it in the comments. Was that the moment she had you, or was it the socks? because I think the socks might be the most romantic thing in this entire story, and I will not be taking questions. If this one settled something in you the way it settled something in me, share it with someone who needs a good love story today. It helps more than you know. And if you're not subscribed yet, come join the pack. I'll see you in the next one.